I call the member for Hughes.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. It gives me great pleasure this evening to rise to speak on the National Disability Insurance Scheme Savings Fund Special Account Bill. And Deputy Speaker, you're right. I declare an interest in this debate, a special interest. 21 years ago, next month, Deputy Speaker, my son Trent was born. And he was born with Down syndrome. A couple of years later, Deputy Speaker, he was diagnosed also with Down syndrome. A double whammy. And Deputy Speaker, we will celebrate his birthday next month. Deputy Speaker, although he is 21 years of age, he has a mental age of around about a 2.5-year-old. He'll be unable to understand the concept of what turning 21 is. He'll be unable to understand the concept of what it means to blow out a set of candles. But Deputy Speaker, we will celebrate because he will understand what the cake tastes like. Deputy Speaker, I have seen firsthand the difficulties of families with disabled children because I've experienced it myself. But Deputy Speaker, I have been lucky because it is the wives that experience it the most. Many of us get to carry on with our job and get up and go to work, where it's our wives that are stuck looking after our disabled children. And Deputy Speaker, I commend my wife for the brilliant way that she has looked after and raised my son for 21 years. So Deputy Speaker, the importance of the National Disability Fund, I think, means as much to anyone in this parliament as it does to me. But Speaker, we must ensure that we can fund it on a sustainable model. And the only way that we can do that, we can't do it through borrowing more money. Government doesn't have a money tree that this can be financed from. The only way we can finance this is by the wealth created in our nation. Deputy Speaker, and that is one of the reasons why I came to Parliament, to ensure that we give the entrepreneurs of this country every opportunity to get out and make the country rich and prosperous that can afford a national disability insurance scheme. Now, Deputy Speaker, I'd like to address claims by Labor members in this debate that the NDIS was so-called fully funded by Labor. Deputy Speaker, nothing more than just a cynical attempt to rewrite history. Let's go over some of the facts, Deputy Speaker. In 2019-2020, which is a little over 2 years away, the cost, Deputy Speaker, of the NDIS is estimated it's going to cost the government $22 billion. That's $22,000 million for 1 year. And Deputy Speaker, that amount will increase year after year, likely greater than the taxation revenue that we can possibly get. And of that $22 billion, Deputy Speaker, about 52%, $1.1 billion, will come from the Commonwealth and the rest from the states. Now let's start off where Labor say this funding comes from. Firstly, Deputy Speaker, I go back to the then Treasurer's speech on the 8th of May 2012, and I quote, "The 4 years of surpluses I announce tonight are a powerful endorsement of the strength of our economy. This budget delivers a surplus this coming year on time, as promised, and surpluses each year after that, strengthening over time. The surplus years are here. I promise." That's how Labor is going to fund it, Deputy Speaker. We know what happened to that promise about the surplus. Even though, Deputy Speaker, they cooked the books. They cooked the books, Deputy Speaker, by bringing expenditure out of that 2012-13 year, by bringing some forward into the year before and pushing some out to the next year so they could create this false claim of a false surplus, a faux surplus into that year, Deputy Speaker. But we know what happened. They were that hopelessly incompetent that they couldn't even get cooking the books right. And that so-called surplus that they promised of $1.1 billion, even though they cooked the books, turned into an $18 billion deficit. And we know, Deputy Speaker, if we read further through that same budgetary speech, it says, this budget finances new policies to help Australians with a disability. Well, Deputy Speaker, there was no financing of it because they couldn't even get the budget into a balance. They ran an $18 billion deficit that year. And that went on. I'm proud tonight, this is the Treasurer speaking, the now member for Lilly. Tonight I'm proud to announce funding for the historic first stage of the National Disability Insurance Scheme. This budget commits $1 billion over 4 years to roll out the first stage of the NDIS. So that's $1 billion over 4 years. $250 million they put in, Deputy Speaker, for each year. Remembering, we need 22,000 million to fund this. Secondly, Deputy Speaker, about Labor's so-called promises to fund this. We had the increase in the Medicare levy from 1.5% to 2%. That was said at the time, Deputy Speaker, would raise $3.3 billion. But going back when that funding and changes to the Medicare levy were announced, the NDIS was estimated to cost $8 billion. We now know it's $22 billion. So where the previous Gillard government said the increase in the Medicare levy by 0.5% would fund 40% of the NDIS, Deputy Speaker, it funds but a mere fraction of it. When we get to 2019-2020, Deputy Speaker, it will be a $4.1 billion that we will have out of a $22 billion cost. Deputy Speaker, it won't fund 40%. It will fund less than 20%. So, Deputy Speaker, at the moment, we have existing funding from the budgets at 1.1. We have a Medicare levy at 4.1. We also have further funding, Deputy Speaker, of redirecting state funding from the existing special disability services that we provide of another $1.8 billion. So adding all those things up, Deputy Speaker, that takes us to $7 billion out of the 22, or $7 billion out of the Commonwealth's total of 11.1. So we have a $4.1 million shortfall to fund the NDIS. Now, what Labor comes in and pretends, Deputy Speaker, instead of some type of game of magic pudding, they have all these savings, Deputy Speaker, they say they've announced, but those savings, Deputy Speaker, they've previously say they've allocated them to reducing the deficit or to financing other things. Now they want to allocate those savings, Deputy Speaker, to say that they are for the NDIS. We know, Deputy Speaker, that in Senate estimates, that those so-called other long-term savings that Labor said would fund this, and I quote, the Senate estimates asked whether measures could be listed in detail. The Treasury's response was, the short answer is no. In other words, they don't have a single clue about where that $4.1 billion will come from. And Deputy Speaker, even at the last election, it was Labor's plan to increase the deficits further. If we are going to fund this NDIS, Deputy Speaker, it must be on a sustainable basis. Every single dollar, Deputy Speaker, we need to set out where that money will come from. And that's what, Deputy Speaker, we in the Coalition are trying to do. We are trying to ensure that the NDIS is fully and properly funded on a sustainable basis to pay that $11.1 billion. And here's the great tragedy, Deputy Speaker. As a nation, this year, we will pay $12 billion in interest on the previous Labor government's debt. If it wasn't for their reckless, and you were responsible as well, you were in that other government, if it wasn't for your reckless and wasteful and politically motivated spending, if it wasn't for that, Deputy Speaker, we wouldn't have that $12 billion interest bill that we have to pay. Deputy Speaker, the interest bill that we have now could fund the NDIS from the federal level in full and with spare change left over. But Deputy Speaker, we have to pay that interest bill on the debt of the previous Labor government. Now, Deputy Speaker, the member for Jagga Jagga talked about, and other members talked about, this so-called $50 billion handout to large companies. This shows the economic ignorance of those that sit on that side. They think, Deputy Speaker, that it's sort of like a fixed pie. You take the money and you give it to big companies here and companies here, and you're taking it away from other people. What incompetence, Deputy Speaker. What complete and utter incompetence. And Deputy Speaker, you want to know how this Labor Party has diverted so far from what they traditionally believed in, supporting the workers. Just go and have a look at the member from McMahon's own special book, Deputy Speaker, where he quoted, and from page 63 of his book, Deputy Speaker, he actually has a separate subheading called Promoting Growth Through Cutting Company Tax. And I'll quote directly from the member from McMahon's book. He says, one of the more controversial reforms by Paul Keating as Treasurer was slashing the corporate tax rate from 49% to 39%. 49% to 39%. That is what a previous Labor Treasurer did. And the member for McMahon writes, I was a fresh-faced Labor Party branch member at the time, and I recall the party as a whole being incredulous that a Labor government would cut the tax for, quote, fat cat companies. I remember a motion at the Young Labor Conference calling for the corporate tax to be lifted to 60% to pay for a program of social reform. But Keating knew that the corporate tax rate needed to be cut to make Australia competitive, that capital investment would flow to tax-competitive nations, and it was an important job creation move. So I asked the question to the members on the other side. When Paul Keating cut the corporate tax rate, this is a question for you, for the member for over there in Lindsay, this is a question for you, you may learn something. Tell me, when he cut the corporate tax rate from 49% to 39%, how much did that cost the budget? Let's go through it. 49% to 39%. How much did that cost the budget? Well, the answer, Speaker, and that's why none of the Labor members would probably even know, the answer, Deputy Speaker, it cost the budget nothing. In fact, Deputy Speaker, in 1987-88, we were getting $8.8 billion in company tax at 49%. When it was lowered, Deputy Speaker, to 39%, guess what happened? Corporate tax receipts increased. In 88-89, Deputy Speaker, they went up 16%. The following year, Deputy Speaker, they went up another 29%, and the following year another 9%. So 3 years after that corporate tax rate was reduced, Deputy Speaker, the budget wasn't worse off. In fact, Deputy Speaker, it was actually better off in company tax receipts to the tune of 60%. That's the lesson from Paul Keating. That's the lesson that today's Labor Party does not have a clue about, Deputy Speaker. Now, Deputy Speaker, the other comments that the member for Jagga Jagga made was referring to the energy supplement. And I think, Deputy Speaker, it's worthwhile quoting from Graham Richardson's, a Labor stalwart, someone that's Labor to the bootstraps, quoting from his piece in the Australian today, Deputy Speaker. And he said, and I quote, watching Question Time in the House of Representatives yesterday was for me as alarming as it was tragic. Mark Butler, Labor's Shadow Minister for the Environment, asked the PM a question on the supply of electricity in New South Wales. Butler's point was that power cut to homes in the Tomago aluminium smelter was in such a state of overwhelming reliance on coal power and not renewables. The opposition and front bench and back bench roared alike. This is Richardson. I was alarmed because this open display of ignorance and stupidity by Labor paves the way for an electoral massacre. That is the member, the former member of this House, the former member of this government. He called It would be indeed a travesty if dumb ideological adherence to renewable policies doomed it to fail.
Time has expired.